On a lonely trail deep in the forest, a black man trekked alone, trying to clear his mind after a crushing career failure. Stopping near a cliff to breathe in the fresh air, he suddenly heard cries for help from a ravine where a stranger clung desperately to the edge. Without thinking, he rushed in and pulled the man to safety. What he didn't know was that this act would completely change his fate, beyond anything he had ever dared to hope for. Before we dive in this story, let us know, where are you watching from? We love to hear your thought. The late afternoon sun hung low over the worn-down streets of New Orleans, painting the cracked sidewalks and faded brick buildings with a sickly yellow light. A warm, heavy air clung to everything, thick with the distant smell of fried food, gasoline, and dust. The storefronts along the street sagged tiredly, windows smudged with the fingerprints of 100 missed opportunities, while a broken street lamp flickered half-heartedly in the growing shadows. Somewhere in the distance, the slow rumble of a passing freight train trembled through the ground like a restless sigh. It was the kind of place where dreams went to die quietly, one late notice, one eviction letter at a time. Inside a tiny, nearly empty store wedged between a pawnshop and a laundromat, Marcus stood alone behind the counter. He was a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his early 30s, his skin a rich mahogany tone that caught the muted light in warm, earthy hues. His face, once full of restless energy and stubborn optimism, now carried the worn-down look of a man fighting a battle he knew he was losing. His dark brown eyes, set beneath a furrowed brow, stared blankly at the quiet street outside, watching the world move on without him. His work shirt, emblazoned with the name of his store, Rooted Naturals, hung loose around his frame, sleeves rolled up past strong, calloused forearms. Marcus had poured everything he had into this store. Every last dollar, every borrowed cent, every ounce of belief he could muster. He had dreamed of creating a space where people from his community could find products made for them by one of their own, using natural ingredients that honored their heritage and cared for their skin. For a moment he had dared to believe he could build something real, something lasting. But reality had been a colder, crueler teacher. The shelves that once stood proudly stocked were now sparsely filled, the bright labels dulled by a fine layer of dust. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, flickering in protest, throwing long, tired shadows against the peeling beige walls. The cash register sat silent, untouched for hours. The only sound was the sluggish whir of an old ceiling fan struggling against the sticky Louisiana heat. Marcus pulled a crumpled envelope from the back pocket of his worn jeans, his fingers rough against the cheap paper. He unfolded it slowly, even though he already knew what it said. Final notice, the bold red letters screamed across the top. Past due on rent. Past due on loans. Past due on time. The sudden shrill ring of the store phone cut through the thick air like a slap. Marcus flinched, his heart thudding painfully against his ribs. He picked it up with a hand that trembled more from exhaustion than fear. "Marcus?" the voice on the other end barked, sharp and impatient. It was the landlord, Mr. Owens. 10 days, that's all you got. After that, you and your little dream are out. Business is business, son, don't take it personal." Marcus swallowed hard, forcing the words out through a throat that felt lined with gravel. "Yeah, I get it." He hung up without saying goodbye and stared down at the receiver for a long, heavy moment, as if willing it to offer some kind of mercy. But no miracles came. The walls seemed to press in around him, the familiar scent of lavender oil and shea butter that once gave him comfort now feeling cloying and suffocating. He shoved the letter into the trash, with more force than necessary, the flimsy metal bin clanging loudly in the empty store. Without another word, Marcus grabbed the keys from the hook behind the counter and flipped the open sign over to closed. The little bell above the door let out a weak, pathetic jingle as he stepped outside into the heavy evening air. His pickup truck, battered and sun-bleached, waited for him at the curb like a tired old dog too loyal to abandon its master. Marcus slid into the driver's seat, the cracked vinyl creaking under his weight. He started the engine, which sputtered to life with a reluctant growl, and for a long moment he simply sat there, staring out at the horizon where the city bled into the wilderness beyond. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay. He needed to breathe, he needed to think, or maybe he just needed to run. One word floated through his mind, clear and desperate: mountains. The Blue Ridge Mountains. He had seen pictures once, miles and miles of green rolling hills and endless sky. A place where the noise of failure couldn't follow. A place where, maybe, just maybe, he could find enough space to remember who he was supposed to be. Without looking back, Marcus shifted the truck into gear and pulled away from the curb. The neon lights of the city faded behind him, swallowed by the gathering dark as he drove toward the only hope he had left. The truck rattled and groaned beneath Marcus as it climbed the narrow, winding road that led deeper into the Blue Ridge Mountains, the trees crowding close on either side like silent sentinels, watching his every move. The fading daylight filtered through the dense canopy in broken shafts of gold and crimson, and the hum of cicadas filled the thick, cooling air with a restless, electric buzz. Gravel crunched under the tires with every twist and turn, and the farther he went, the smaller the world behind him seemed to grow, swallowed up by the towering green walls of the wilderness. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale against his deep brown skin, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. His mind spun in circles, running back over every mistake, every broken promise he had made to himself and to the people who had once believed in him. The store, the money, the dream, all of it slipping through his fingers no matter how hard he had tried to hold on. When the road finally ended at a small dirt parking lot, Marcus killed the engine and sat there for a moment, the sudden silence pressing against his ears like a heavy blanket. He could hear the distant rush of a stream somewhere beyond the trees, the low hoot of an owl waking for the night, the whisper of the mountain breathing around him. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, he felt something close to peace, thin and fragile as spider silk, but real. He shouldered his battered canvas backpack, filled with little more than a few bottles of water, a cheap first aid kit, and a half-smashed granola bar, and headed up the trail. His boots scuffed against the packed earth, dry leaves crackling beneath his steps, and the path rose sharply almost immediately, making his legs burn and his breath come short and fast. But he didn't care. He wanted the pain. He needed it to drown out the louder ache in his chest. Hours passed, and the woods deepened into a thick, shadowy maze of towering oaks and ancient boulders draped in moss. Marcus moved steadily, stubbornly, even as his muscles screamed for rest. He climbed until the trail narrowed to little more than a rocky ledge, hugging the side of a steep ravine, the ground falling away into a tangle of sharp rocks and twisted trees far below. And that was when he heard it, a desperate shout carried on the wind, raw and jagged. Marcus froze, his heart slamming into his ribs like a sledgehammer. Ahead of him, the trail crumbled away into nothing, dust and gravel spilling into the yawning darkness below. A man clung desperately to the broken edge, his fingers clawing at the loose dirt, boots kicking wildly as the earth betrayed him inch by inch. "Hold on!" Marcus barked, his voice raw and fierce over the howling wind. He surged forward, boots skidding, palms burning as he reached out. "Don't let go. You hear me? Grab my hand." The man's eyes were wide, whites flashing in the dim light, a wild animal terror in them. For one agonizing second he just stared, frozen, as if too afraid even to move. "No!" Marcus shouted, lungs ripping with the force of it. With a strangled cry the man lunged, fingers like iron vices snapping onto Marcus's wrist. The jolt nearly tore Marcus off his feet. His boots skidded over the crumbling dirt, his knees buckled. For a split second they both teetered at the edge, the endless drop gaping hungrily below. Marcus gritted his teeth so hard pain lanced through his jaw. "Don't she dare let go!" he snarled, voice a ragged growl. Muscles shrieking in protest, he locked his legs, digging into the loose earth, feeling it shift treacherously under him. The man was dead weight, dragging him down inch by inch. Marcus's vision blurred. Sweat stung his eyes. I can't hold." "No!" he roared aloud, furious at the thought, at the fear, at the world. With a guttural yell, he heaved backward, summoning every last shred of strength from somewhere deep and wild inside him. Dirt exploded around them in thick clouds. With one final savage wrench, Marcus yanked the man over the edge, sending them both crashing down in a bruising heap. They lay there, gasping, coughing, trembling, alive. For a long moment, Marcus just stared up at the bruised sky, heart battering against his ribs like a trapped bird, the man's desperate grip still latched onto his arm as if he might disappear without it. Then Marcus let out a ragged laugh, half relief, half disbelief. "Made it," he rasped, voice cracking. "We got then made it." They lay there for a long minute, side by side on the hard ground, staring up at the darkening sky, too stunned and exhausted to speak. The trees loomed high overhead, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze, the stars just beginning to prick through the thinning blue like tiny watchful eyes. Finally the man turned his head toward Marcus, his face pale and streaked with dirt and sweat, his chest still heaving. You saved my life," he rasped, disbelief thick in his voice. Marcus, breathing hard, closed his eyes briefly, feeling the burning in his muscles, the raw scrapes on his palms, the distant thud of his racing heart. "Yeah," he muttered hoarsely, a rough, tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Guess I did." The fire crackled and popped, sending tiny sparks twisting up into the night air like frantic fireflies, while the dense forest around them settled into a heavy, watchful silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of some unseen animal slipping through the underbrush. The dark pressed close, thick and impenetrable beyond the fragile circle of light cast by the flames, and the cold night air sank its teeth into the earth, sharp and merciless. The rocks beneath Marcus felt hard and unforgiving as he sat cross-legged across from the stranger he had just saved, his tired muscles protesting every small movement. But he welcomed the discomfort. It kept him grounded, kept the surreal edge of the night from swallowing him whole. The man, now introducing himself as Thomas, sat huddled near the fire, his clothes torn and smeared with dirt, his blond hair sticking up in messy tufts where he had raked his fingers through it too many times. His face, still pale from the near-death experience, carried a worn, weary look Marcus recognized all too well. The look of a man running from something he couldn't quite escape. They hadn't spoken much at first, both too drained to do more than grunt and nod as they built a rough shelter out of fallen branches and emergency blankets Marcus had stuffed at the bottom of his pack. But now, with the fire warming their hands and the adrenaline slowly draining from their veins, the words began to come, slow at first, like rain starting to fall on dry ground. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter around himself, staring into the shifting flames, and after a long moment he said, voice low and steady, "I used to think hard work was enough. Thought if I built something honest, something real, people would come. Thought maybe I could make a difference." Thomas looked over at him, his blue eyes catching the firelight, reflecting it back with a strange, quiet intensity. He said nothing, just listened. Marcus went on, the words spilling out like a dam had cracked inside him. "I opened a store, natural skincare products. Stuff made for people like me by someone who actually gives a damn. I wanted to give my neighborhood something better than the junk that gets shoved into our communities, but the customers never came like I thought they would. Bills piled up, rents overdue, banks breathing down my neck, families embarrassed, friends pretend they don't see me anymore." His voice broke a little, and he cleared his throat roughly, stabbing a stick into the fire, sending a shower of sparks jumping skyward. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but steady. "Sounds like you built more than just a store. Sounds like you built hope." Marcus gave a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Hope don't pay the bills, man." For a while they sat there, letting the fire speak for them in its own crackling language, and then Thomas said almost to himself, "I used to run a company. Big one. Wall Street types, you know the kind. Numbers, profits, meetings, more numbers. It ate everything. My time, my health, my soul. One day I looked in the mirror and didn't even recognize the man staring back at me. So I walked away. Figured maybe if I stripped everything down, got back to basics, I'd find whatever I lost. Marcus studied him through the waiting heat, feeling the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. It was strange, finding something so human, so raw, in a man who looked like he had stepped straight out of a magazine ad for success. Thomas shifted, pulling something from the inside pocket of his dirt-stained jacket. A plain white business card, no fancy logo, no title. Just a name and a phone number printed in simple black ink. He held it out across the fire, and for a moment Marcus just stared at it, the card catching the firelight, almost glowing in the darkness like a lifeline dangling inches from his grasp. "If you still believe in what you built," Thomas said, his voice low but firm, "then I want to hear more. Put together your plan, think it through, make it tight, then call me. No promises, but I want to listen." Marcus reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against Thomas's calloused hand as he took the card. It felt heavier than it should, as if the little piece of paper carried the weight of 1,000 possibilities. He tucked it carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket, feeling it settle against his chest like a second heartbeat, and when he looked up, he found Thomas watching him with a steady, unreadable gaze. The fire between them burned lower, but neither man moved, the silence stretching out wide and deep, filled not with fear or doubt, but with something far rarer, something that felt a lot like hope. The city felt louder, harsher, more suffocating than Marcus remembered as he drove the battered truck back through the crumbling streets of New Orleans, the towering gray buildings looming like stone giants, the horns blaring, the sidewalks teeming with hurried faces that didn't see him, didn't care if he was there or not. The tangle of traffic lights blinking red and yellow against the dirty glass of storefronts made his head ache, and the heavy, sticky air clung to him like a second skin, pressing against his chest until he could barely breathe. He parked near his shop without thinking, staring blankly at the peeling sign above the door, the windows now covered in a fine layer of dust and grime, the inside just as empty as when he had left it. Marcus sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel so tightly the leather creaked under his fingers, the small, plain business card Thomas had given him tucked safely into the inner pocket of his jacket, feeling heavier with every passing minute, like a stone tied to his heart. Doubt gnawed at him like rats chewing through rotten wood. What if it had all been a game? Some rich man's amusement, a way to pass the time after almost falling off a cliff? What if he was setting himself up for one more humiliation, one more lesson in just how naive he really was? That night, sitting cross-legged on the cracked linoleum floor of his apartment, surrounded by unpaid bills and empty fast food containers, Marcus showed the card to his best friend Jaden, a wiry Latino guy with sharp brown eyes and a mouth that rarely stayed shut. Balters snorted loudly, shaking his head as he tossed the card back onto the floor like it was trash. "Man, you gotta stop falling for that fairy tale crap. Some white guy you barely know talking pretty around a campfire? That ain't real. That's not how the world works for people like us." Marcus stared at the card, his jaw tight, the muscles in his neck tense enough to snap. "Maybe it's not real," he said quietly, his voice rough. "But what if it is?" Jaden rolled his eyes, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "What if it's not? What if you pour everything you got left into this and he ghosts you? What then, huh?" Marcus didn't answer. He just sat there, breathing hard through his nose, feeling the old familiar cocktail of fear and anger bubbling up inside him. But somewhere underneath it all, deeper and harder, was a tiny flicker of something stubborn, something he wasn't ready to let go of just yet. He spent the next 2 days locked in his tiny apartment, barely eating, barely sleeping, hunched over his battered laptop with bloodshot eyes, reworking his business plan until the keys were slick with sweat and the outlines of numbers and market strategies danced behind his eyelids every time he blinked. He ripped the old plan apart, built it back up from the ground, carving away every weakness, sharpening every point until it gleamed like a blade ready for war. Marketing plans, customer profiles, scalable product lines, a 3-year growth strategy. He poured every lesson, every mistake, every desperate hope into it until the plan wasn't just a document anymore. It was a living, breathing extension of his dream. When the morning of the meeting came, Marcus stood in front of the towering glass building downtown, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the buzz of the city around him. The sun glinted off the mirrored windows so bright it hurt his eyes, and the massive revolving doors at the entrance seemed to mock him with their slow, lazy spin. He wiped his sweaty palms against his jeans, straightened his second-hand blazer that hung a little too loose on his frame, and stepped inside. The lobby was a sea of polished marble and chrome, the air conditioned to a sterile chill that made the sweat on his back feel even colder. Men and women in tailored suits moved briskly through the space, barely glancing at him as he approached the reception desk, feeling like a worn-out stray dog trying to walk through a palace. "I'm here to see Tomas," Marcus said, his voice steady even though his insides twisted like a gut full of snakes. The receptionist barely looked up, just nodded and pointed him toward the elevators. He rode up in silence, the elevator climbing so fast his ears popped, and, when the doors slid open, he stepped into a sleek conference room where sunlight poured in through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a long table where half a dozen people in sharp suits sat waiting. At the head of the table Thomas stood, looking clean and confident in a dark blue suit that probably cost more than Marcus's truck, his blonde hair neatly combed back, his blue eyes sharp and clear. Marcus froze for a second, the air rushing out of his lungs like he'd been punched. This wasn't some burned-out exec hiding from his past. This was a man who ruled rooms like this. Thomas smiled faintly and gestured for Marcus to come in. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said smoothly, his voice carrying easily across the room, "this is Marcus Taylor. He's here to present something I believe you'll find interesting." The next hour was a blur of questions, challenges, skeptical frowns. Marcus stood at the end of the long table, presenting his plan with everything he had, feeling the weight of every glance, every whispered note passed between the suits. He stumbled once or twice, caught a few raised eyebrows, but he powered through, hammering home his points, defending his vision, like it was his own blood on the table. When he finally finished, sweat soaking the back of his shirt, he waited in a silence so thick it felt like drowning. Thomas leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen thoughtfully against the polished wood, and then he smiled. A real smile, not the polite kind. "I'm willing to invest," he said, and the room stirred like a nest of startled birds. "But there's work to be done. You'll need to tighten your marketing model, segment your product lines more strategically, and build a sustainable 3-year growth plan with quarterly benchmarks." Marcus could barely breathe, could barely think, his head spinning with the rush of adrenaline and disbelief. Somehow, against every odd stacked against him, he had made it through the first gate. And for the first time in a long, long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world still had a little bit of room for a guy like him after all. The sun beat down hard on the gleaming glass windows of the new store, casting sharp reflections across the wide sidewalks where a small crowd had already gathered, their faces bright with curiosity and cautious hope. Banners snapped in the warm breeze, the bold letters reading "Grand Opening, Rooted Wellness" stretching proudly across the entrance, and the smell of fresh paint, new wood, and blossoming jasmine from nearby planters filled the thick summer air. Inside, the space was a world away from the dusty, broken-down store Marcus had left behind. Sleek wooden shelves lined with vibrant, colorful products, natural light pouring in through huge windows, soft music humming low from hidden speakers, the floor polished to a mirror shine where the first customers now shuffled, wide-eyed and whispering. The shelves weren't just filled with pretty things. They carried affordable fresh grains, natural remedies, and health essentials, all priced low enough that no one from the neighborhood would have to choose between dinner and dignity. Marcus had stood outside that morning, the key cold in his hand, staring up at the blank windows that now reflected the burning sun. He had turned the key over and over between his fingers, feeling its worn edges bite into his palm. It was strange, he thought, how something so small could hold something so massive. Hope, fear, the weight of a whole community that had long been forgotten by the city planners and the market maps. This gift had once locked out dreams. Today it opened them. His heart squeezed tight, then loosened as he stepped forward, slid the key into the door, and turned. The soft click rang louder than any shout. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was claiming something, not just for himself, but for every kid who had ever walked past boarded-up storefronts and thought, maybe one day. Marcus stood near the register, hard hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it might crack them open, his dark brown hands trembling slightly as he straightened the lapel of his new fitted jacket, the deep navy blue setting off the rich mahogany of his skin. He watched as people drifted inside, touching the products with careful fingers, reading labels, nodding to each other, and he felt a knot in his chest loosen just a little. Behind him, on a tall glass display, sat a photo in a simple black frame. Him and Thomas, side by side, grinning awkwardly in the first chaotic days of building this dream from the ashes. Thomas stood by the window now, his blonde hair catching the sun, a half-smile tugging at his mouth as he sipped coffee from a paper cup, looking utterly at ease among the chaos. The picture of a man who had never doubted this day would come, even when Marcus had been too scared to believe it himself. It hadn't been easy. God, it had been anything but easy. Long nights fighting over supply chains, branding designs, website builds, marketing strategies. Days when Marcus wanted to throw in the towel, when every fiber of his body screamed that this was too big, too much, too far beyond anything someone like him was supposed to reach. But Thomas had been there every step, pushing, questioning, believing in a way that had sometimes made Marcus furious, and sometimes made him feel like maybe he wasn't crazy after all. And now here they were. A bell jingled brightly as the front door swung open wider, letting in a rush of hot air and more customers, and Marcus forced himself to step forward, to smile, to welcome them, each handshake and nod feeling like a thread sewing him tighter to this new reality. Later that afternoon, when the crowd thinned and the cash register rang less frequently but more steadily, Marcus and Thomas stood side by side near the front counter, looking out at the bustling street beyond, the weight of everything they had built humming in the air between them. Thomas nudged Marcus with his elbow, a rare softness in his voice. "You ever think about what's next?" Marcus huffed a laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm just trying to survive today, man." Thomas shook his head slowly, smiling. "Not survival, legacy." The word hung there, heavy and electric. 2 weeks later, standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of a community center gym that smelled like old sweat and stale popcorn, Marcus watched as the first group of teenagers shuffled uncertainly into the room, clutching notebooks and second-hand laptops, their faces a mix of suspicion and fragile hope. He cleared his throat, nerves jangling in his gut like loose change, and stepped forward. "Welcome to the Rooted Futures program," he said, his voice carrying across the scuffed hardwood floor, strong and sure. "This ain't charity, this is investment. We're going to teach you how to build something real, how to make something last." He caught a glimpse of Thomas standing in the back, arms crossed, a faint, proud smile on his face, and for a moment Marcus felt the world tilt just slightly, shifting into a new shape he barely dared to believe in. He thought about the night on the mountain, the cold biting his skin, the fear and the fire, and the weight of a stranger's hand in his own. He thought about the card, the meeting, the risk, the countless moments when he could have given up but didn't. And as he looked out at the faces before him, young, fierce, full of dreams they barely dared to voice, Marcus knew with a bone-deep certainty that this was only the beginning, because someone had once reached out a hand to him when he was hanging over the edge. And now it was his turn. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.